The Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.
Hello again. Thank you for accepting our request for the interview.
What are the current achievements and challenges in the development of internet infrastructure in Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia?
So recently, GSMA published a report. It's called Closing Digital Divide in South Caucasus and Central Asia. So our focus was actually these three countries and the countries of Central Asia, and also the development of mobile technologies there. I would say that the mobile penetration and the penetration of mobile internet is rather high in our region. If we watch from the coverage perspective, 99% of the territories of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia are covered with mobile internet networks. But still we have the usage gap, right? That is, depending on the country, roughly from 20 to 30%. It means that people live in the areas that are covered by mobile networks, but they don't use it for different reasons, right? And also, I would say that affordability of the communications is rather good in these countries. So in terms of the prices for the connectivity, they are one of the lowest in the world. So, and the governments and private sector, they have a number of different initiatives, right, of stimulating digital development in the countries. It applies both to the government programs and also to the private initiatives, right? So we can speak about some examples later on, but yeah, I would say that the countries are going in the right direction. Of course, they are not the leading countries in the world in terms of mobile connectivity, but I would say they are on a good path. And later on, I will also elaborate on mobile connectivity index from GSMA, how we evaluate countries based on their development.
Which government or any private initiatives have been most successful in improving internet access in these three countries?
I wouldn't want to highlight only one country, right? There are projects in each and every country, right? So, for example, there is an interesting initiative now in Azerbaijan. They have a joint project, Azer Telecom with Kazakh Telecom, of building the fiber under the Caspian Sea, right? So it would be a new digital route. They call it digital Silkway, the new digital route from Europe to Asia. There are a number of initiatives in Georgia, for example, the Digital Georgia strategy focusing on enhancing digital infrastructure and services. In Armenia, collaboration between government and telecom operators to improve network coverage. And we can speak about 5G auctions that took place in Armenia and Georgia recently as well.
How significantly does the availability and quality of internet differ between urban and rural areas in these countries?
So if we look at the coverage, for example, right, as I mentioned, 99% of the countries are covered by mobile networks, but at the same time, if we look at the latest technology standards like LTE or 5G, it's only big cities that are covered. LTE is better, right? Because LTE we also have in rural areas, but not like 99% of the country is covered. And this is happening in many parts of the world due to obvious reasons. Economically, sometimes for operators, it's not really necessary. They don't have a business case to go into the rural areas, right? And they have a big capex and opex investments, but the return on investment is not that high in rural areas. And of course, it's important for the government to stimulate the infrastructure development in those areas, right? And as I mentioned in our report about closing digital divide, we share some of the good examples, right? How government can stimulate this. Sometimes it's going through different policy initiatives. For example, in Kazakhstan, they had a policy initiative called 250 plus. It's a government initiative to build internet connectivity in rural areas and small settlements where more than 250 people live. And the government of Kazakhstan, they provide big discounts on spectrum fees for the operators that are building networks in rural areas, up to 90%, right? So it's a good example of the initiative, how government can stimulate the deployment of digital infrastructure in rural areas. And it can be also done via public-private partnerships. In many countries, there are universal services funds, and operators, they contribute part of their revenues in those funds, right? In some countries, these funds work good. In some, they don't, depending on how those funds are designed and how good they are monitored and how good the distribution of funds is happening.
What steps have already been taken to implement 5G in Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia? What are the main obstacles related to 5G implementation in the South Caucasus?
If you look at the 5G development in those three countries, worth mentioning that Georgia and Armenia already had 5G spectrum assignments. That's a first step in order to make 5G live in those countries, right? So in Georgia, one operator got spectrum licenses for 5G, and it received the spectrum in different bands. Worth mentioning that they received in low band, lower than 1 gigahertz, and also in the mid band. It's important to keep the balance between different bands while assigning spectrum for 5G, right? So in order to have good speed and also good coverage, right? So as I mentioned, Armenia and Georgia already had some initial steps in this domain. It's important for regulators not to consider 5G auctions as the way to attract money into the budget. It can be one of the reasons, but also there should be always a balance that operators still have enough money to invest in the 5G development, right? And it's important for the governments to stimulate operators to build networks of the latest standards. In Azerbaijan, operators, they are now conducting the trials, 5G trials, so they have certain hotspots in the big cities of providing 5G services, but still it's done not on the commercial basis yet.
Further, can you talk about your predictions regarding the time frame for the widespread adoption of 5G in the region?
So as I mentioned, I would say that operators are pioneering 5G at these countries at the moment. And we know that there are countries like South Korea, for example, where 5G coverage is almost, 100% already, and most of the users, use 5G services. But so a lot of factors play here, and according to our predictions from GSMA, now around 1% of the users in the broader Eurasia region, right? I would say it's South Caucasus, Central Asia, Russia, Belarus, right? Around 1% of users, 5G adoption is 1% at the moment, but according to our forecast, it will reach up to 40% by 2030, right? So we will see massive 5G adoption in the coming years in the region. And of course, operators are driving 5G as they are the one who launched the service. And, it's a chicken and egg problem. As soon as you have 5G services, you will have new applications, you will have new applications in B2B domain. So it will stimulate certain economic growth and certain development of technologies in the region.
What are the positions of Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia in global ranking in measuring the quality of mobile and broadband internet, and how it changed through the past few years? Which countries lead these rankings and why?
Yeah, so I will mention few ratings, right? For example, one rating is from GSMA that I already mentioned. It's called Mobile Connectivity Index. And we evaluate countries based on their digital development in a number of aspects. First is the infrastructure, right? How well the infrastructure is developed, how much spectrum is assigned for mobile technologies and so on. Second is affordability, how affordable the mobile technologies for population, not only mobile like tariff plans, but also the smartphones or devices, where the population have enough money to buy those devices, right? The third one is the basic digital skills from the population, where the population have digital literacy. And the fourth one is the services and whether there are local services, because very often local services, they stimulate the usage of digital technologies. For example, e-government services might stimulate the usage of the internet in rural areas. And also it's important that those services are secure for the population, right? Because there are a lot of fraud these days, so it's important that the networks are secure. So we evaluate based on those four criteria, and there are a number of parameters. And I would say that all three countries, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, are in the group of advanced countries, right? They're rather advanced already. So this rating is published online. Anybody can go and play with the numbers, check different countries. So they are advanced. There are also countries that are leaders, right? Such countries as US, I don't know, South Korea, Singapore, I don't know, Switzerland, UAE, right? Of course, those countries are on the forefront of launching different technologies. So I would say that they are well positioned, right? All three countries are well positioned. They still have a room for improvement, especially having in mind that they're only in the beginning of their 5G journey. But already in terms of infrastructure deployment and affordability of the services, they are on the good track. And if, as I mentioned, the government works together with the private sector in improving the situation, in perspective, they might go into the leaders segment.
What specific measures need to be taken to improve the quality of the internet in these three countries? Which investment and technologies are the most prioritized?
I would say that the situation with the mobile technologies and mobile technologies industry is roughly the same in many parts of the world, right? So operators bears huge investment burden, right? So they need to invest into the networks. CapEx investments are rather high and OpEx is rather high because the infrastructure is really massive that operators manage. So, and it's important, as I mentioned, to keep the balance between the government requirements and the capabilities of the operators. For example, if the new spectrum is assigned to the operators via direct assignment or an auction, it's important to keep the balance by the price operator pays for this spectrum and the requirements from the regulator in terms of deployment, right? For example, if you request operator to deploy the network in 2-3 years across the whole country, then it means the investments should be higher. And so likewise, the price for spectrum should be low, right? And there are a number of initiatives that can stimulate network investments. First is the spectrum prices and the balanced approach on designing those. Second, taxation, also double taxation shouldn't be applied, right, to the industry. Third one is, for example, EMF limits and also the requirements for the operators, how well the procedures are designed in order to deploy networks and launch networks, right? Whether there is a lot of bureaucracy on getting all the papers and so on. So there should be always a balance. And we can see that in most of the countries, regulators are looking for the best practices, right? And GSMA is sharing those practices with the regulators and operators in order to implement those and stimulate network deployment.
What impact or factor could improving internet quality have on the economy and social sphere of these countries? Can you share a successful international example which can be a suitable model for the South Caucasus countries?
First, I would like to share one example of, for example, now, if you look at the Eurasia region as a whole, right? The average consumption rate in terms of mobile internet is around 13 gigabyte per user. So it's a big number, right? Each user on average consume every month 13 gigabyte. And according to our predictions, this number will increase by 2030 to 40 gigabyte, right? It's more than 3 times, right? Roughly 3 times.
Yeah.
So, and it means that the operators needs to meet those requirements from the users, right? And expand their networks accordingly. That's the first thing. So we see if there is an opportunity for consumers to consume more, they do it, right? And also the contribution of mobile industry in the GDP of the region, of Eurasia region, was roughly 8% in 2023. That is around 200 billion US dollars, right? And also mobile industry and adjacent industries provides around 770,000 jobs in the region as well, right? So it's not only mobile operators, but also the companies that interact with mobile operators, right? I don't know, logistic companies and so on and so forth, right? So we can see that 8% of GDP is contributed by mobile technologies in the region. And according to our prediction, if the expansion is continuous, this number might increase, right, by few percent by 2030. And it's happening all over the world. Mobile technologies, they stimulate development of different adjacent industries. For example, I don't know, fintech, right? Or sharing economy or streaming. It all appears with mobile technologies, right? So of course, there is a huge contribution of mobile industry in the development of the countries, and it's in government's interest to stimulate those developments.
What role does GSMA play in the development of mobile infrastructure in Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia?
So we interact with our members. All the operators in those countries, right, are members of GSMA. And of course, they contribute to our work and they benefit from participating in GSMA working groups, knowledge sharing with the other operators, and so on, right? Getting best practices from GSMA. So we work with the operators in those countries almost on a daily basis, especially in the questions like roaming and those type of activities, right? Because GSMA is coordinating those activities a lot. That's the first thing. So operators, they participate in the working groups from GSMA on different questions, right? As you probably know, we develop certain standards. For example, eSIM standard, when you can have, digital SIM in your smartphone without the necessity of insert physical SIM. This standard is also developed by GSMA, and we help operators to deploy it in different countries. We work with regulators, as I mentioned, a lot. For example, we have capacity building. It's trainings that we organize free of charge for the regulators. And we organize those in our region as well. For example, we organize events, as you probably know. Our biggest event is Mobile World Congress Barcelona that we organize every year, more than 100,000 participants. And participants, both government and private sector from Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, they attend the event every year. But we also have regional event. It's called M36 Eurasia. We hosted it in Baku this year in May, and we organize capacity building training there for government authorities from the region, right? And every year we choose different topics for those courses, and we also have an online platform for government authorities to get to know better about global best practices in industry regulation. Yeah, so these are the main areas, I would say. And of course, if there are specific questions from time to time, we organize workshops with both regulators and our members, mobile network operators in those countries, to address certain questions. And it might be some advanced technologies like 5G or some legacy technologies. I don't know, VoLTE, for example, is still being deployed in our region, right?
Do you think that the acknowledgement about the latest trends in the Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, like their acknowledge about the technologies, latest technologies?
As I mentioned, the stakeholders from these countries, they participate in global events. They meet with their peers from different markets, right? From Europe, US, I don't know, Middle East or Asia. And yeah, so I would say no issues with this. The world now is so well connected that getting access to the information is not an issue, right? You only need to want to get one. And I would say that both government stakeholders and stakeholders from the private sector from those markets, they always very proactive in, engaging with organizations like GSMA and as I mentioned, their peers from other regions, or with organizations like ITU, right? So to get the latest information, to get global best practices and implement them in their markets.
The Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.